Welcome. This is the Living Philosophy Podcast. I am your host, Vince Lopes. When we speak about the ecological crisis, we usually name its symptoms: climate change, mass extinction, collapse in ecosystems, industrial agriculture, and extractive economics. But beneath these symptoms lies a deeper and rarely named question. Who do we think we are in relation to the rest of life? Because how we act toward Earth is inseparable from how we understand our place on it. My suggestion today is simple but far-reaching. Many of our ecological and ethical failures are rooted not in bad intentions or insufficient knowledge, but in a particular story we tell about ourselves, a story known as human exceptionalism. And I want to explore what becomes possible when that story begins to loosen and another begins to emerge, a story of ecological kinship. This is not an argument for sentimentalizing the more than human world, nor for erasing real differences between species. It is an invitation to rethink differences not as hierarchy, but as relationships. Human exceptionalism is the idea that humans are fundamentally separate from and superior to the rest of the living world. Not merely different in degree, but different in kind. It is the view that humans alone think, feel, value, or matter in a morally significant way, while animals and ecosystems exist primarily as background resources or instruments. This story has deep roots. Philosophically, it draws on a sharp split between mind and matter, culture and nature, reason and instinct. Theologically, it appears in hierarchies that place humans closer to the divine and other beings lower on the ladder of value. Historically, it was reinforced by a view of nature that treated the world as a giant machine and animals as inferior cogs within it. Culturally, this aligned perfectly with colonialism and industrialization, both of which required a world that could be owned and managed. The crucial point is this: human exceptionalism is not simply a set of beliefs, it is a way of inhabiting the world. It teaches us to stand apart, to look down, and to manage rather than participate. What is striking today is that our own empirical knowledge has begun to unravel this story. Evolutionary biology shows continuity, not a rupture. We are made of the same stardust and genetic code as the forests and the oceans. Ethology and cognitive science reveal complex forms of communication, emotion, cooperation, and even culture among many animal species. Neuroscience shows that the architecture of feeling and perception is widely shared across the web of life. In short, the more we learn, the harder it becomes to sustain the idea that humans stand on one side of a vast abyss, with all other beings on the other. And yet, culturally and ethically, exceptionalism remains powerful. Why? Because it is not only a scientific or psychological claim, but also a cosmological orientation. It answers the question, what kind of universe is this? And where do we belong within it? If the world is imagined as a collection of objects, human dominance feels natural. But if the world is a living process, dominance looks like a tragic misunderstanding. Ecological kinship begins from a different intuition. It does not deny human uniqueness, but it locates our creativity as an expression of a living earth. To speak of kinship is not to claim sameness. Kin are not identical, they are related. Ecological kinship recognizes that humans and the more than human arise from a shared history, inhabit overlapping worlds, and depend on the same planetary conditions. It understands life not as a ladder of value, but as a community of differences. Across various traditions, from indigenous cosmologies to process philosophy, a common insight emerges. We do not stand outside the web of life. We are formed within it. Animals as fellow participants. From the perspective of kinship, animals are not lesser versions of humans. They are distinct ways that the earth lives, senses, and responds. Each species inhabits its own meaningful world, its own patterns of attention and skill. To encounter an animal, then, is not merely to observe an organism, but to meet another center of life. This requires something quieter and more demanding than just studying nature. It requires learning to attend. It is the recognition that animals are not merely in the world, but instead that we share that condition. When we shift from exceptionalism to kinship, ethics change its tone. The question is no longer only what rights do animals have, or how should we manage nature. It becomes how are we called to respond to other beings who share our world. Ethics here is less about abstract rules and more about cultivated sensitivity. It is about learning when restraint is needed, when care is required, and when humility is the only appropriate response. This does not yield simple answers or moral purity, but it does reframe responsibility, not as a burden of managing the planet, but as a responsibility, our capacity to respond with respect to the living community we belong to. Let me end not with a solution, but with a question. If humans are not masters of the earth, and not strangers to it either, but participants in a living community of beings, what kind of humans are we being asked to become? What might change in our ethics, our sciences, and our culture if we truly learn to see animals not as resources, but as fellow inhabitants of a shared world? I offer these thoughts not as answers, but as openings. In the next episode, we will dive into a visionary framework I call Earth Realism. Earth Realism starts by acknowledging the weight of our current predicament, the climate crisis, species extinction, and the social suffering that stems from our separation. But it does not stop at the crisis. It builds upon the vision that the earth is a living, self-organizing community, offering us a grounded pathway toward a future where humanity functions as a conscious, integrated part of the whole. Until next time, may your thinking be clear, your actions aligned, and your becoming unshakable.